Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Met Office entitled Mitigation, a Road to Net Zero. My name is Richard Beardsworth. I am Professor of International Relations at the University of Leeds, and I head the School of Politics and International Studies. My research is on the politics of climate change, and I will be your chair today. This is a 1-hour webinar, so we need to be efficient with our time. I'll briefly refer to the housekeeping rules, speak to our theme, and then introduce our speakers who will then follow through. Housekeeping rules first. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Met Office's Science and Services YouTube channel, and I'll remind people of that at the end. Webcams and microphones are obviously disabled, but the Q&A and chat will be monitored throughout the webinar, so please feel free to either add your questions or like a question already asked that you consider pertinent to our discussion. Questions and answers will follow our three presenters, and we will aim to answer the most recurring, the most popular of the questions. This seminar is a collaborative space among colleagues, so please be respectful of others if and when asking a question. Thank you. Following my comments, each speaker will have 7 minutes each, and I will keep to time. The Q&A will follow between 15 and 20 minutes accordingly, and speakers will then have together 5 minutes, 1 to 2 minutes each, to make any closing remarks that they consider important. And I will follow up with some concluding comments so that we end at 2 o'clock. Our theme. This webinar considers what is meant by net zero and looks at the priorities of the UK government for achieving the aim of net zero by 2050. Our speakers will consider the science and how the science helps the implementation of a net zero strategy, sharing, among other things, I'm sure, lessons learnt to date. The IPCC's synthesis report of the sixth assessment, the executive summary of which was published yesterday, is utterly clear that the states of the international community are not on a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit pathway, but that alternative strategies and effective policies still remain possible. The UK government ratcheted up its climate ambition at COP26 in Glasgow with the aim of reaching 68% CO2 and its equivalent emissions reductions by 2030 on a baseline of 1990, a clear condition of achieving net zero by 2050. The Independent Advisory Committee to the government, the Climate Change Committee, and other review boards have also clearly stated that the UK is not presently on track to meet this mitigation ambition. The strategy and policy question of which roads to net zero is therefore vital to us all, nationally and internationally. Our speakers are here today to help us answer this question. Rose Durkin will speak first, but I will introduce all three speakers together. Rose works in climate science team in the new Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, specifically working on climate mitigation. Her main areas of interest are around land use mitigation, options for climate mitigation in the land use sector, and biomass sustainability. And her specialism is in soil and land use sciences. Rose has previously worked on the land use change and forestry sector of the UK greenhouse gas inventory. Rose will be followed by Dr. Fiona O'Connor. Fiona is a research fellow at the Met Office Hadley Centre and a senior lecturer with the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. After her bachelor's and master's degrees from the National University of Ireland, Fiona completed her PhD at stratospheric dynamics at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. She developed expertise in atmospheric composition modelling by working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge, before taking up her role at the Met Office Hadley Centre in 2004. Her key areas of interest include chemistry-climate interactions and climate change mitigation, with a particular focus on near-term climate forces. Fiona will be followed by Barbara Peralta-Smith. Now, Barbara is a strategy and policy principal in the Civil Aviation Authority's new sustainability team. She has worked at the CAA for 12 years on projects where sustainability and the environment in aviation are a focus, including on climate change adaptation, environmental information provision, noise policy, and more recently, she has led the development of the CAA's Environmental Sustainability Strategy, published in May 2022. Barbara is skilled in strategy, stakeholder engagement, and communications, and works closely with the UK Regulators Network, chairing their climate change network to encourage a collaborative and coordinated approach across the sectors on decarbonisation. So, those are our three speakers. We have our theme, which roads to net zero. Rose, you have 7 minutes, and I will then pass on to the next.
Thanks,
Rose,
Richard.
over to you.
So, in 2021, the UK government published its net zero strategy, which sets out how the UK will achieve reaching net zero emissions by 2050. There are a number of key policies highlighted in the strategy which will demonstrate how we will reduce our emissions, including, for examples of many, a fully decarbonised power system by 2035, future-proofing of industrial sectors, and a number of nature-based solutions such as restoration of peatland in England, increased tree cover through afforestation, and increased biomass feedstocks production and use. In addition to the net zero strategy, the Climate Change Act also sets legally binding interim targets for 5-year carbon budget periods, which require reductions in emissions across all sectors of the UK economy and puts us on the path to achieving net zero. So we've set these targets, and then it becomes about how we can achieve them. And the road to net zero provides us with multiple opportunities and challenges as we work towards setting policies which will aid in the mitigation of emissions and climate change. And a key part of this is in innovation, and it plays a key role in the net zero strategy, with a drive to develop new processes and technologies that can reduce emissions and mitigate against existing greenhouse gas levels. One part of this in particular is greenhouse gas removals, which provide a major opportunity, and technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, enhanced rock weathering, and biochar, providing the potential to provide abatement where emissions reductions from other activities are quite difficult. But these options also present challenges, such as how do we deploy them at scale, what are any potential long-term risks, and how do we ensure the permanence of greenhouse gas removals. And that's something that we're thinking about quite a lot, with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero currently having a number of programmes which are working to address these challenges, such as the Energy Innovation Programme, Direct Air Capture and Greenhouse Gas Removals Programme, and multiple greenhouse gas removal demonstrators. So in addition to innovation, how we use land is also incredibly important in mitigation and how we will reach net zero. At the moment, this is the only sector which reports both sources and sinks of emissions, so it has an enormous potential to be able to increase its carbon sinks, which will aid in abating emissions from hard to decarbonise sectors. And options such as afforestation, peatland restoration, soil carbon sequestration, they can all increase carbon removals. And appropriate land management provides a great opportunity for aiding the UK in reaching net zero. But a major challenge of this is that we really need to understand how we can maximise these removals and minimise these emissions, which would ideally be done to a high degree of spatial resolution, which takes into account regional climate, soil types, and other demands on food, on land, such as settlements and food. We have multiple strands of work which are working to address these issues and building the evidence base around land use and solving some of the challenges we're faced with in this sector. And as I've previously said, there are some areas of the UK, sectors of the UK, which are hard to decarbonise, such as transport, industrial processes, product use and housing. And this provides additional challenges to achieving net zero. And we need to understand how we can minimise emissions in these sectors while maximising removals in other sectors, such as the LULUCF sector, and also innovation to provide further abatement. So it's not directly related to mitigation, but I wanted my last slide to emphasise the importance of robust and accurate greenhouse gas accounting and how important that is in reaching net zero. The greenhouse gas inventory is central to the UK's domestic and international efforts to tackle climate change, and the accurate reporting of emissions enables us to monitor and measure the impact of mitigation actions and our progress towards our climate targets. And the greenhouse gas inventory is improved and updated each year with major improvements such as the inclusion of peatlands or more minor improvements such as updated activity data. But the challenge remains of how we can future-proof our inventory to allow for new technologies and carbon mitigation actions. And with such an emphasis on innovation in the net zero strategy, emergent technologies such as BECCS and DACs and other GGRs will need to be included in future inventory compilations. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero recently launched a multi-year inventory improvement programme, which aims to go beyond immediate measures for improvement and address medium and long-term needs that the inventory system must be ready to account for, given the changing science, policy and emissions landscape to 2050. And this programme of work will improve the ability of the inventory outputs to inform efforts to meet our climate targets and mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, thank you.
Rose, thank you very much indeed. Very, very insightful presentation. I think there's a little problem with the slides, people coming up. So can I hand over to Fiona, who's next? And Fiona, can you make sure the slides fill out the whole of the screen in presenter mode? Fiona. There, that's much better. Thank you, Fiona.
And you could hear, thank you, Richard, and you can hear me okay now?
Yes.
Thank you. So Rose has given us an overview of the net zero UK government policy and outlined some of the opportunities and challenges of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science background to net zero and mitigation. So I'm going to give a little bit of science background to net zero. I'm then going to focus a little bit on near-term climate forces and how they might help us in terms of net zero. And then I'll say a little bit about how science can continue to support the path towards net zero. And then if time allows, I'll talk a little bit about the Met Office's own net zero policy. So this is a figure from the Working Group 1 6th Assessment Report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows that there's a near linear relationship between the global mean temperature rise and cumulative emissions of CO2. So for every tonne of CO2 emissions, we add to global warming. And it means that reaching net zero and limiting cumulative CO2 emissions is a requirement if we want to stabilise climate. Likewise, if we want to limit global temperature rise for a particular climate target like 1.5 degrees, then it means we have to limit cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. So if we quantify the cumulative emissions to date, then the difference between that and this limit, then we refer to as a remaining carbon budget. And this next slide, included in the synthesis report that was published yesterday and mentioned already by Richard, shows a plot of the remaining carbon budget. You'll see the historical emissions and the cumulative emissions over the historical period at the top left in grey, and in green is showing the remaining carbon budget if we wish to reach limit climate change to 1.5 degrees with a 50% likelihood in line with the Paris Agreement. You'll see that if we aim for a higher target of 2 degrees, then the remaining carbon budget represented by the second green bar is larger. So that remaining carbon budget is referring to carbon dioxide emissions only. However, if we were to reduce non-CO2 greenhouse gases like methane, then we could actually increase the remaining carbon budget for the same climate target, or indeed we could stabilize the climate at a lower temperature for the same remaining carbon budget. And that nicely leads me in then to talk about the role that near-term climate forcers might play. So this is an example from a study published by Zosia Staniasek last year, in which they implemented a rapid, deep and sustained cut in anthropogenic methane emissions. And both the climate and the surface ozone response to that strong mitigation is shown here in blue. And it can be compared with a counterfactual shown in red. And you'll see that the rate of warming decreases over the few decades following the intervention, and you'll see that surface ozone concentrations, an air pollutant, decrease. And this is what we might consider a win-win. There's a slowing of the rate of warming, so a win for climate, and there's an improvement in surface air quality, so represents a win for air quality. This second study, again, is related, but looks at a wider range of pathways, both looking at methane mitigation, but also methane removal, which Rose already mentioned. And again, we find that there's a near linear relationship between the temperature response and the surface ozone response to the amount of methane removed. We also see that there's a linear relationship between the timing of passing a particular threshold and methane removal. And you'll see that in the top left there for different temperature thresholds of 2, 3, and 4 degrees. And we also see that the peak temperature that we might reach is determined by methane emissions rate. So where for CO2, it's cumulative emissions that matter. In the case of methane, because it's shorter lived, it's actually the emission rate itself that matters most. And of course, we know that at COP26, for example, a global methane pledge was announced, and there are now over 150 countries signed up to that pledge to reduce global anthropogenic emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by the year 2030. And we expect to see air quality benefits in terms of human health and crop yields and so on as a direct result if that ambition can be realised. So I've talked a little bit about the science background to net zero policy. Met Office Weather and Climate Science and Services can continue to support the path to net zero, in particular on mitigation. And I've already mentioned some examples of that, but we're starting to look at alternative fuels, for example, like a hydrogen economy. We can provide further evidence on remaining carbon budgets as some examples of the kind of work we can continue to do. And monitoring is also in there, a key point that was raised by Rose. And finally, I wanted to talk about the Met Office's own net zero policy. And the figure there is showing a projection of our emissions out to 2030, in which we have an ambition to reach net zero by 2030. So you'll see in yellow, we project that the emissions associated with our building, and in particular our electricity supply, will be much reduced due to our switching over to renewable energies. But you'll see that there are remaining emissions there that become much harder to mitigate, and indeed the rate at which we may be able to reduce them is far reduced. Some of those emissions are related to our critical infrastructure, our scientific data collection. Some of it's due to travel, for which we have targets to reduce, and some is also reduced related to procurement and supply chain, which is much more difficult. And you'll see by 2030, we won't be able to cut our emissions completely to zero, and what remaining emissions we do have, we aim to offset, and we recognise that offsetting isn't ideal, and there's a challenge there in terms of identifying what's suitable in terms of an offsetting scheme. And I think the main point here is that reaching net zero is challenging. We ourselves don't have all the answers, and we will evolve and learn from others as we go forward. And I'll leave it there and pass on to the next speaker, Barbara. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm hoping you can see that and you can hear me. Thanks. So we have heard a little bit about the government net zero strategy. We've heard from Fiona about net zero science. We know that transport is one of the areas that is most difficult to decarbonise, and aviation is of course part of transport. So in this introduction, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the CAA's, the Civil Aviation Authority's roles in sustainability in the context of our new environmental sustainability strategy, but also particularly within this landscape that is complex and uncertain. What can the aviation regulator realistically do to improve environmental performance of the total aviation and aerospace sectors? And it's a system of system problem. So we know aviation delivers significant economic and cultural benefits regionally, globally. However, we also know that the sector is facing a challenge to mitigate emissions, noise, other adverse impacts. Sustainability in aviation and elsewhere is complex, is a long-term challenge with issues of sequencing, uncertainty, interdependency, needing system thinking, and with the added complication of having to maintain consistency of messages throughout good taxonomy, coordinated comms across all the various players. At times, it feels like an unsurmountable challenge and one that needs more than collaboration to make progress. And I'm going to quote the UN Secretary General in response to the IPCC report that said, we need an approach for everything, everywhere, all at once to deliver global transformational change. Definitely true. Limited travel doesn't feel progressive because mobility offers societal, cultural, and economic benefits, and we know industry considers climate change an existential threat to the health of their business, particularly as consumers are becoming more opinionated and protesters more fierce. So we want to believe that decarbonising the sector is a possibility. The aviation and aerospace industry are investing in new, more sustainable fuels, new forms of propulsions, more efficient operating procedures. Government in the UK and globally are setting targets and introducing policies, incentives through fiscal measures, for example, to create the conditions for industry to deliver the required improvements. And regulators such as us at the CAA have also a distinct role and a responsibility to enable the achievement of these targets. And this is where our environmental sustainability strategy comes in. It provides clarity externally to our stakeholders. It also provides our colleagues and those we regulate with information on our roles, remit, and ambition on how we work together to improve environmental performance. And this is for the benefit of consumers, users, and the wider community. With this aim in mind, our strategy sets out how we plan to enable improved performance within our statutory and our regulatory framework, but also trying to flex those to maximize impact, to be agile, to be ambitious, to be credible, be clear about realistically what we can and we can't do, and recognizing where we can focus our expertise to achieve unique value. It's designed to galvanize action internally as well as externally and empower our colleagues to explore innovative solutions and test the art of the possible. Of course, we continue to focus on safety, security, and consumer protection in the aviation sector, but we want to be ambitious and prioritize sustainability across a number of areas. And these are all the areas that we'll focus. I won't read them all out because you can see them, but I will pick 2 or 3 of them for a little bit more information. So first, we contribute and where appropriate, we lead to the Jet Zero Council. This was set up by government to ensure a coordinated response to the net zero challenge in aviation. We are involved in its delivery groups, the zero emission flights and the sustainable aviation flights, and we chair the regulation subgroup, which is focusing primarily on mapping out the current regulatory landscape to understand the journey towards making this fit for purpose to enable the introduction of novel technologies into the market. Secondly, we acquired a number of reporting functions, partly from the closure of ICANN, which was the Independent Commission for Civil Aviation Noise, and partly from the UK leaving the EU. So we have a duty to produce a triennial report on the environmental performance of the UK sector in the same vein as the EASA's European Aviation Environmental Report. We also focus on exploring the feasibility of sharing information on the environmental impacts of flights to consumers to improve their travel choices. And thirdly, we are spending more and more time on exploring the double materiality of risk assessment and how not only aviation impacts the environment, but also how the environment impacts aviation. So the mitigation and adaptation, where we benefit greatly from collaborating with our Met Office colleagues. So this work and the government mechanisms we have put in place in our organization, such as dedicated sustainability team, internal panel providing scientific expertise to challenge us, and a focus to improve sustainability culture within the CAA are all contributing factors to the way that we are committed to work with industry, collaborate with government and international partners to enable a sustainable aviation sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all 3 speakers. A great deal of information there, which I think will take us time to digest, but the presentations are there. So thank you very much to all 3 of you. We're going to turn now to the Q&A. We have about 15 or so more minutes. There's quite a lot. There are quite a lot of questions in the chat. I'd like to start with one that, let me just get to it. Let me find it, by Graham Madge, which I think is picked up quite a lot. And then there's a following question by Norman, which works with it. So let me just read out Graham's question to all 3 of you. I pose it to all 3. Yesterday's IPCC assessment reveals that the aspiration of stabilizing global temperature at or below 1.5 degrees is at best looking increasingly unlikely. So overshooting the 1.5 target is more likely. Doesn't that place even greater urgency on developing carbon dioxide removal techniques, but which remain largely untested at scale at this time? I put the question out to all 3 of you, given you the different areas of expertise. How would you respond to that kind of concern that Graham and several others have in other questions? Who would like to start? And am I going to put someone on the spot?
I can come in here,
you.
Richard. So it's very clear that if we want to stabilize the climate at a particular target, we then have to limit our cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. And what Graham says there is quite right. It's very likely, because of the remaining carbon budget continually shrinking, it's very likely that we will overshoot. And the only way then that we may come back to a 1.5 degree target is actually reducing that cumulative CO2 emissions that have remained in the atmosphere and effectively get into a negative carbon dioxide emissions regime. And something like carbon dioxide removal is one of the potential techniques for doing that. But Graham is quite right that actually that technology is only in its infancy and really hasn't been tested at the kind of scales that might be required.
Thank you, Fiona. Rose, Barbara, would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can jump in. Sorry, my laptop's having a bit of an issue and it's being really slow. Essentially, yes, I agree with Fiona. The more we overshoot, the more we need carbon dioxide removal. And we don't know yet if it's available at the scale that it's going to be required at. So I think what's important is that in the short term, we mitigate as fast as we can rather than relying on it with other options such as nature-based solutions, peatland restoration, afforestation, and so on. So yeah.
And that is true for aviation too. There is a recognition that even if the aviation sector sort of races to net zero by 2050, there will be leftover carbon emissions. And although I do agree with Rose insofar that the sector for the moment is really focusing their efforts on reducing emissions and investing in low and zero emission technology, sustainable aviation fuel, synthetic fuel, etc., to get to the point where by net zero there'll be as small amount of emissions to offset as possible.
Could I just add a question there? I'm going to pose it to Rose because you are in the Department of Energy Security and Delivery. It's a question coming out of our audience. It's a policy question, but I pose it to you. If you don't want to answer it, I fully understand. Do we actually decide to force oil and gas companies to develop CCS, carbon capture and storage?
I don't think I can comment on that.
I thought not. Anyway, I think it's clear where perhaps we would move on that one. There's a question, I'm going to turn it away from there because I think there is consensus about that and obviously a great sense of anxiety and uncertainty about the scale of CDR given where we are in terms of stock. I think there are two very good chats there on that from Graham and Norman. A question that comes up, and I'm just going to get to it, so give me a second to roll up to it, that comes from Chris, which is it's turned to housing, but it is one of those sectors that has been reviewed as being under reflected within the overall net zero strategy. Why and it's a demand side question rather than a supply side question. Why is the UK government not prioritising building energy efficiency? Lower bills, lower energy demand, lower carbon. That would seem, as Chris puts it very laconically, that would seem a no-brainer. Why isn't the net zero strategy addressing that? And it clearly doesn't really address it. Are there any thoughts from the three of you? I know you're not exactly in that sector, but do you have thoughts around that really quite important question, especially with regards to the 28 million homes that we have in the UK? Nothing? Barbara?
Well, I can sort of only agree with the sentiment.
It's a political urgency, isn't it? It's one that really needs to be incorporated into the net zero strategy. Yeah.
I think some of that is to do with taxonomy and good communication. There is much to be said for not forgetting to consider the public and the consumer sentiment into this whole climate change debate. Having consistent messages to raise awareness, to educate the public, so that when opportunities to take up sort of government incentives on renewable energy, on heat source pumps are put forward, the consumer is educated enough to understand that there is an opportunity there to make savings and also do good to the environment. Taxonomy and good communication really takes you a long way towards that.
Yeah, and Barbara, would you agree that in a sense in the net zero strategy at the present moment, there's very little on public engagement and there's very little on what you are concerned with, public provision of information?
I couldn't comment, on how government carry out, and publicizes their strategy, but certainly taking into consideration the sentiment of the consumer, the passenger in our case, is very important. If we look back at the Committee for Climate Change report from 2019, the net zero report, it said that up to 60% of measures that we have to put in place to deliver net zero are reliant on an element of behavioral change. This is actually not insignificant. And for example, we are doing some work at CAA to make sure that passengers, when booking flights, have got access to comparable, accurate information so that they can make positive choices. They can see different airlines and how environmentally friendly, efficient those flights are. And all those little things help to nudge positive choices towards better, transport choices.
Mm. Fiona, can I just follow up though, because you were speaking to us about the net zero strategy at the Met Office, and the importance of that for the public is clear. This question of engagement with the public, societal and behavioral change, that's an element that stands obviously next to technological innovation and carbon capture removal. Would you have anything further to comment yourself, Fiona, of coming from the Met Office on the way in which the engagement with the public is so important to get behavioral change and demand of carbon products down?
I mean, I think that question, Richard, is very much out of my domain. But so I'm not sure I can necessarily speak from a Met Office perspective. But from a personal perspective, I would see that there's an opportunity here, because it's very much foremost in people's minds now about the cost of energy and the need to reduce bills. So if anything, there is an opportunity here for greater public engagement, particularly in relation to homes. And as a direct response to Chris's question, I don't know the answer as to why it isn't a priority, but it clearly should. I guess the challenge is that the UK has quite a large stock of older houses, and I guess retrofitting is a challenge. And I guess Rose might be able to comment a little bit more. But I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment of the question for sure.
Yeah, it was an unfair question to you, climate scientist. I understand that. Rose, do you want to add anything? And then I'm going to ask a question to the climate scientists from out of the IPCC report. Rose, is there anything you'd like to add to the previous conversation? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm struggling to unmute myself. I don't have too much to add because it is quite far outside of my knowledge area. But yes, it is a challenge, and it becomes a challenge of when you have hot summers and cold winters, whether you're insulating it to the point a building can't cool down, or cooling it down to the point it can't heat up. So it does remain a challenge of how we go about doing this, but I can't comment overly on the policy because it's not really my area.
I understand completely. Just going back to the IPCC, I mean, we just received the executive summary so far of the synthesis report, but Antonio Guterres, when he presented it from the United Nations, spoke about trying to bring our targets back down. So rather than talking about 2050, we talked for developed countries in terms of 2040, rather than talking about 2060 or 2070, be it China or India, we started talking about 2050. And that sense of ambition and urgency of action was critical to the way in which we now formulated the targets. That is a scientific question. It's a political question, obviously, but can I put it to the scientists here? What do you think about that question of bringing the targets closer?
I mean, I could kick that off, Richard. I mean, I think it's very clear from the remaining carbon budget that we need to drastically reduce emissions. And of course, the sooner we can reach net zero, the lower our climate target would be. And of course, yesterday there was emphasis that for every 1/10 of a degree, beyond, say, a 1.5 degree target, for every 1/10 of a degree greater than that, the risk of droughts, of flooding, of heat waves, and so on also increase. So it's really quite imperative that we we try and reach net zero as soon as possible so that we can limit that cumulative CO2 emissions that are reaching our atmosphere. And I think from the emissions gap report that was published last year, there was a clear gap between current ambitions and current national defined contributions and what's required in order to stabilise climate and reach net zero. So I would agree with that, but I would say there's a huge challenge in trying to bring those targets and ambitions more forward in time.
Well, as a non-scientist, can I ask you a naive question, Fiona? I mean, how challenging is it scientifically to bring those targets down?
I'm not sure I'm necessarily the right person to answer that, but emissions are integrated in every aspect of our lives, in our buildings, as we've talked about already, in our modes of transport, in the way we heat our homes. It's hugely integral, and so it's a challenge even on a UK scale, in terms of replacing gas boilers, for example, with potentially heat pumps, or the conversion or the transition of our car fleets from combustion engines to electric vehicles. Just the timescale over which that will happen probably isn't rapid enough. So there are challenges at every level, I think, in terms of energy production, energy use, transport, huge systemic changes that are required here, Richard.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, Rose or Barbara, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, clearly, we're not answering the questions, but we're delimiting the areas where action needs to be taken. Rose, Barbara, would you want to add anything with regards to the IPCC targets?
Nothing but saying that I agree with Fiona in terms of it being a massive systemic challenge. Resolving the problem in aviation alone is a systemic challenge, and that is just one system within a system, which obviously makes the challenge exponentially difficult and at times, overwhelming. But we can only do one thing at a time and focus on what it's in place already, doubling the efforts to accelerate that progress. In aviation, there are cohorts forming with industry, regulators, government, NGOs at an impressive scale. The Jet Zero Council is one example to focus efforts on developing low and zero emission technology. The government in its Jet Zero strategy has proposed a 2040 target for all airports to be net zero. So the industry recognizes this existential challenge to its very well-being and existence. The efforts are there, and it's just a case of focusing it and creating a positive culture so that we realize that it is everybody's problem.
Yeah, again, the question of it's communication and engagement, isn't it? Can I move it? I think we know where we are here, and we know where the burning questions are. Can I turn to a more specific question where I think I'm going to come back to Fiona, but again, I leave the question open as well. But Fiona, you very much addressed in your presentation this 30% reduction by 2030 of methane emissions. Yeah, and there is a question from a guest, which is from MG. Calls him or herself. Is the reduction in anthropogenic methane outweighed by thawing of the tundra, which releases large quantities of methane?
So thank you for that question, MG. You're quite right that in addition to anthropogenic man-made emissions of methane, there are also natural sources of methane. And you mentioned tundra as being one of them. Wetlands, for example, are another. And in fact, wetlands are currently are the single largest source of natural methane emissions into our atmosphere. So in the studies that I showed on methane, we actually include the representation of wetland emissions, and in those studies we did take account of the potential climate change impact on the magnitude of wetland emissions, but found that by reducing anthropogenic emissions sufficiently strongly, that we could counteract potential increases in wetland emissions. However, I think your question also refers to, you mentioned tundra, but I think possibly you're referring to permafrost, where carbon is currently stored in frozen organic soils in the Arctic regions, and that potentially may thaw and release carbon either in the form of CO2 or methane or both to the atmosphere. And that's what we refer to as a positive climate feedback. So at present, we're doing a lot of work. Our colleagues of mine at the Met Office are doing lots of work in order to develop capability whereby we can include permafrost processes and potentially include representations of emissions to the atmosphere. But those studies that I presented don't include that, and that is a potential additional positive climate feedback that we do need to consider, and may indeed have an impact on the climate benefit that we might get from mitigating methane emissions. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Fiona, for a very clear response. We're coming to the time where I need to turn back to the speakers. There are lots of very good questions in the chat. I think we will endeavour to answer those questions if we can offline. So to be aware of the chat. There's a question particularly on UKRI, which I think I can respond to. Otherwise, there's some very good questions, for example, on hydrogen. And again, a lot of questions on building and on the question of carbon dioxide removal. So at this point, with a few minutes left, I'd like to leave 5 minutes to the three speakers. You presented, you've heard each other. We're talking about roads to net zero. We've got a large, both international and national environment where we know there is enormous urgency of action. And in a sense, we're going to have to work negatively so that the term removal has come up quite a lot, but also the term of societal behavioral change has come up, as if there are several pillars by which we need to look at what is obviously a very complex and comprehensive problem for us all. You know, as Antonio Guterres said yesterday, and I think Barbara mentioned it, you know, it's a problem of anywhere, everywhere, and everything. And we need to select within that. So what I would like to ask the three of you in a sort of minute's comment is, as you select and from your expertise and where you feel your jurisdiction is speaking as possible, what are your final comments about the road to net zero for the UK government? Rose, I think I'll start with you as your situation in the Department of Energy Security, and obviously, you know, speak as you feel fit with regard to that kind of question. And if you want to remove the UK government, you can. But we are talking about the net zero strategy.
Yeah, of course. So I think in terms of the net zero strategy and the road to net zero, we do know what we have to do to get there, and now it's about from the government working out how we do that. So we have innovation, which is ongoing challenge, and we have multiple projects which are addressing this, but then there are also things we can do in the short term, such as nature-based solutions and so on. And I think a key challenge for us now is working out and identifying where we can achieve what in the UK. What future climate impacts will be on those options in terms of things like peatland restoration and afforestation, and what we can do in the short term to mitigate against emissions and climate change as quickly as possible. And also, as I said in my presentation, I think it's really important that we strengthen how we report and measure emissions as much as possible so that we can actually track the progress that we are making. Because I think that is key in monitoring our progress to net zero.
Yeah, the question of monitoring and evaluation. Thank you for that, especially that last comment. It's critical, isn't it? Barbara, can I turn to you next?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Well, we've talked about drivers and we've talked about enablers. So the drivers, particularly in aviation, being technology, innovation, the sustainable fuels, and the enabler being, the regulation, the roadmaps, the investments, the incentives. But may I just sort of return once more to the importance from a strategic point of view of ensuring we have that good taxonomy, those consistent messages, and the passengers, the consumers, and the public on our side, because those are the people that will use the technologies, that will have to respond to, the government nudges for positive behaviours in all sectors, not just transport, also, in other sectors. Sustainability is a system problem. Considering all these aspects is fundamental part of the challenge. And we heard the IPCC chair say it's, without sounding, myself naive, underwhelmed, or delusional, it's tackling climate change is hard, it's complex, it's enduring. The scientific community has spelt out the facts that we need to take into consideration, but there is hope through this concerted, genuine, global transformational change, which we can deliver through collaboration.
Clear, strong message. Thank you, Barbara. Fiona.
Thank you, Richard. So just a final remark from me. I think the science was very clear from yesterday's publication of the synthesis report in that, the likelihood of overshooting a climate target like 1.5 degrees is ever becoming increasingly likely. But science can continue to support the path towards net zero and support stabilization of climate through supporting mitigation pathways and assessment of those pathways, investigating the climate impact of potential alternative fuels like the hydrogen economy, which I know came up in the chat, but we didn't have time to consider. And science, of course, can still play a role in monitoring both climate and emissions as we move towards a net zero. And every 1/10 of a degree matters. So even if we can't reach 1.5 degrees, we do need to try and limit that climate change as much as possible. And science can help to support that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And thinking of that notion of science supporting, I mean, quite clearly, when scientists have been shouting from the rooftops, haven't they, for a very long time. But now that question of where science can work with the public, as well as obviously with government, that is critical that we, all of us, try and coordinate and collaborate in that overall initiative. Thank you to all three of you. Addressing very big questions. I think very big questions, and questions coming to you are very big. And we obviously could only do a certain amount within 1 hour. I think it shows just how important these webinars organised by the Met Office are. So my thanks to the Met Office for hosting this, to the three speakers for speaking so clearly and with such conviction about what is required. And my thanks also to you, the audience, for your many questions and comments, and clearly that enormous sense of engagement with the priorities ahead of us. As said, this recording will be available shortly on the Met Office Science and Services channel on YouTube. And can I just add to that a couple of things? The Met Office has many webinars this year on climate science, and the next one is in May on co-benefits, an important topic with regard to what we're speaking about. So please, if you have not already on the email list of the Met Office, just email the Met Office, find it on Google, obviously, to become a member of that mailing list for future webinars. And finally, could you possibly, at the end of this, fill in the short survey on what you've thought about this seminar? It's very helpful to the Met Office, obviously, in terms of also future arrangements and seminars. So, on a very big topic, thank you very much indeed to all of you, and have a very nice day. Bye-bye.